Who are we doing?
Samsung.
Good evening. Welcome to another episode of Activate Worcester. We have some really interesting things to share with you tonight. And we've got a wonderful guest who's doing a return engagement. He was our guest previous week. There was so much more in his subject matter. We wanted to bring him back. He was available. And once again, he's come to Worcester for us. And I'll let Sandy, my affable co-host, explain that to you in a minute. Affable. But he's quite affable. We also have a we feel, an exciting development within Activate Worcester. And I'd like Sandy to share it with you.
Well, right there at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the URL for the activateworcester.com, and that's where you can provide feedback on the shows. So we certainly encourage you to do that. Take a look at it and let us know what you like, what you don't like, what you'd like to see more of, and we'll see what we can do to help out along those lines. As for tonight's show, as Ron said, we have a return engagement. Hopefully you've seen the prior show with Tim Roesch, where we threatened to talk about the Constitution, and Tim and we spent a lot of time talking about what got us to the Constitution, what made America unique in those early days, 500 or so years ago, and where we are now. So what we'd like to do now is take you from where we left off in that prior show and get into the meat and potatoes on the Constitution. So, Tim, thanks for coming back.
Thank you very much.
Great seeing you again.
I think I left you guys right at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Mm-hmm. I'm going to jump over the Revolutionary War, not because I don't think it's important, but because that's another show altogether. The Revolutionary War is over. We've won, but now we have a problem. There's a lot of debt. I don't know if that's ever happened again after that. I don't know if there's any debt issues now, but there was a lot of debt right after the Revolutionary War. The Continental Congress had done everything, probably up to and including fraud, to try to keep the troops fed and clothed, and now the bills were coming due. And these were not just bills between the states, but these were also bills with foreign countries, for instance, France. So how do you pay for that? Well, like kids in a candy store without any parents and thinking that the candy store is all theirs, most of the states began printing money. And essentially what you have in about that decade, right after the end of the Revolutionary War, is essentially, I would say, 600 years of failed banking policy condensed into that one time. Essentially, governments realized, whoa, we owe $1 million. We'll just print $1 million worth of notes of currency. And, of course, that caused huge amounts of inflation. It meant that, especially people here in Massachusetts, couldn't pay their taxes. People are unaware that at one point you paid your taxes in marijuana and hemp. It made great rope, which is why our ships could sail closer to the wind than the British, who used jute from India. Hemp makes a much better weatherly rope. But countries weren't looking for that, at least then. They wanted gold. They wanted silver. They wanted stuff. And Massachusetts and some of the other colonies didn't have stuff. But they had paper and they had printing presses. And the term "not worth a continental" was a term made up from them because that was the money was called a continental, and states felt we could just pay our debts by printing more of it. And that caused a huge amount of trouble. Now, at the time, after the American Revolution, we were under what were called the Articles of Confederation. You can Google that and look that up. It's found in a variety of places. You could read it and pretty much see why it failed, because it didn't do what the colonies wanted it to do. The colonies wanted some referee to make sure smaller colonies weren't picking on the bigger colonies or vice versa. You had problems with waterway usage. New York City was already causing trouble with who could use the Hudson River and who could, how do you get to New Jersey across the Sound and Long Island. You had all these different problems. States threatening to tax goods that came from one state and went through them, but other states were left alone. There's a lot of problems, a lot of not quite, but almost fisticuffs. I mean, some of the states came very close to leaving or invading another state. So there were a lot of problems. And it really came to a head, again here, like Lexington Concord started. Many people think it's shot heard around the world. That's where the American Revolution started. The American Revolution almost ended with Shays' Rebellion, which was here in Massachusetts. Captain Shay was a Revolutionary War officer. He wasn't getting paid his back pay. He wasn't getting paid his veterans' benefits. He got a little ticked off, and him and a few of his friends decided to burn court documents that showed how much money they owed on their land. They were trying to, because they were losing, farmers were losing their property because they couldn't pay the taxes. And this caused a rebellion. And it was about this time that George Washington is approached with the idea, do you want to be king of America? And this is probably the beginning of the formation of the U.S. Constitution, because it was obvious that what the Articles of Confederation weren't natural. They didn't follow the idea of natural law. There was obviously a mistake. We could see it in the problems going on. So our founding fathers locked themselves up into a room in Philadelphia and created the U.S. Constitution. Again, I'm not going to go into specifics about the dates and times. It's not a history class where I'm going to ask you a multiple choice test. By the way, if you didn't know it, all the schools in America, but certainly in Massachusetts, are required to teach courses on the U.S. Constitution, especially right around Constitution Day, which occurs in the first couple weeks of September. You might want to ask your students, because I don't call them children, if they're learning that in school. Because a lot of this information is not coming up in school. When I tutor kids and ask basic questions, they don't know these things.
I remember in school spending weeks on the Constitution. Weeks and weeks.
I remember spending, even in that liberal bastion in California, I remember a great deal of time. I won't tell you what my grandmother almost did to me when I told her what they said about the American Indians in California and how much they loved the Spaniards. That's another story for another time. Trust me, an angry Mohawk grandmother is not somebody you want. But anyway, there were a lot of problems and a lot of issues that aren't brought up. I bet people don't know what Shays' Rebellion is, and it occurred here. There's still markers. You can find historical markers in the state concerning Shays' Rebellion. So the Constitution was created because our founding fathers realized if we didn't do something to stitch these colonies together, they were going to fall apart and then just be picked off one by one. You had the Spaniards in Florida, you had the French in Canada, you had the British, who were probably still a little ticked, and as 1812 rolled around, they showed they were about losing their colonies. And so the founding fathers realized if this experiment was going to work, we needed to put together a document to make it work. Now, the problem with if you want to know about the formation of the U.S. Constitution, the Federalist Papers are the document to read. And the problem with Federalist, Anti-Federalist is the names, the monikers flip-flopped a couple of times. But essentially what you had was people that felt a federal government would become dangerous. Now, I don't know who would have thought that. But the federal government
never happen.
It would never happen. But it was possible the federal government could become tyrannical. And there were some people that said that we shouldn't have the federal government. But there were other people that realized without a federal government to make sort of basic choices and decisions, all we would have is a bunch of squabbling colonies, which wouldn't lead to freedom and people living their life the way they wanted to. And that's an important point to realize. The people who made the Constitution were not trying to create a government to tell you what to do. They were trying to create a government to let you do what you want to do and take care of all the other stuff. I have a quote. I'm going to read it verbatim because I don't want to get it wrong. This is from Patrick Henry. The Constitution is not a document for the government to restrain the people. It is an instrument for the people to restrain the government, lest it come to dominate our lives and our interests. That would never happen. right? But that's a perfect explanation. Patrick Henry was very much against a federal government. He felt it would get out of hand. Virginia was very, and if I remember correctly from my history, Patrick Henry was from Virginia. I might have that wrong. If I'm wrong, you can yell at me later. And it also means you went and looked into it and Googled it, so that's good. But Virginia was very much against joining the United States, if you will, because of this, because of the federal government. And the Bill of Rights was written mostly to placate them, to show them, look, we're telling the federal government back off. And the first 10 Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments, were not to give you, the people, rights. Those amendments were written to tell the federal government that was created by the states. This is important. The federal government was created by the states to be a servant to the states and the people. The federal government, in only very limited ways, should be telling the states what to do. And how we've let things come to this point, I don't know. But if you believe the Constitution is a living document, then you have to discount all the things people like Patrick Henry said, all the history, the fact that George Washington realized there was a problem, and instead of saying, oh, sure, I'll become king of America, decided, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to encourage some other form of action to keep America together. Mm-hmm. So we had people in this country who had an opportunity to become the king of America, and they chose not to. They chose not to do that.
In the previous show, you basically articulated very, very well how the people that came to this country came here to escape oppression, but also to establish their own identity and to be the rugged individualists, if you will. And part of that is why they wanted to break away, obviously, from Great Britain and so forth. And the Constitution, as I understand it, was basically put together as a framework, a legal framework, almost like a contract between the feds and the individual states. So everybody could do their own thing within those parameters. Is that fairly accurate?
That I would say it's fairly accurate. I might be a bit more radical and say that you could tweak that a little bit. Mm-hmm. It was the states created the federal government.
They invented it.
They invented it and then limited it. So it was a contract between the states and their new federal government they created. Mm-hmm. And it was supposed to be very set in stone. In other words, this is what you can do. The Article 1, Section 8 gives the powers of the federal government. And we've gone far beyond them in many ways. In some ways, people would say, oh, but no, that's not, Theodore Roosevelt and the National Park Service. Oh, what would have happened? We wouldn't have had Yosemite and we wouldn't have teddy bears. Mm-hmm. Sadly, it's not in the power of the federal government to take large chunks of land from the states and turn them into federal preserves. Mm-hmm. Now, one could say Theodore Roosevelt didn't mean any harm by it, but the problem is there are some states that have almost no state-held property anymore, Utah and Nevada being two of them. The Adirondacks is a constant issue I know of in upstate New York. You have little towns in the middle, and the federal government comes in and tells the towns what they can do. Because, oh, it's federal government, but we're from New York. It doesn't matter, you're in the Adirondacks. So the states were creating a device called the federal government and wanted to limit its powers severely. And then some states would not sign, would not ratify this document unless there was a list, and this is what Madison did, a list of the specific rights that the states and the people had, in the sense of the government couldn't touch them. So again, when you see in the First Amendment, and it says you have the freedom of speech, for instance, you're not given the freedom of speech by the First Amendment. You already have it. The First Amendment is telling the federal government, you won't touch this. Here is a reminder. Okay? Go in the Second Amendment. Everybody talks about a well-regulated militia. As has been proven time and time again, the first supporting clause is not limiting what your rights are. It says one of the things you can do with your right to have arms. And it's a reminder to the federal government, you step on too many toes, the people are going to gather together and go after you. Because that's what the Second Amendment really is saying. It's assumed you could go hunting. That's how you fed yourself. It's assumed you could protect your life. If you can't protect your life, what's the freedom of speech? How can you have freedom of religion if somebody can just kill you? The Second Amendment was all about telling the federal government, people have got guns, back off. Now, maybe that's radical. Ooh, everybody's going Columbine. Oh, Newtown. Those are different issues altogether. Those are criminal actions. What the states did is they wanted a reminder to the federal government, back off. These are your rights. This is what you can do. Step over that line, and the final box, I don't know if you've heard that saying, there's the 4 boxes of liberty. That final box is a cartridge box. And I don't think anybody wants to go that far, but that was the reminder. It was not so you can go hunting and target shooting. We can go on. We can go talk about the different freedom of religion. Everybody talks about separation of church and state. It had nothing to do. The separation of church and state doesn't appear in the document. So again, if you hear somebody saying separation of church and state, that's as if you and I put together a contract. You're going to sell me a car, and I'm going to pay you a certain amount of money per month. And when I pay that, I get the car. So we make a contract, we get it all legally signed, and you step in and decide, you know what, I don't want you selling the car to him, I want you selling it to my brother, so I'm going to annul your contract. Well, that's against the law. You can't just step in and annul a contract. So part of the government's job was to protect contracts, but I think I got myself a little sidetracked with the contract thing, but the separation of church and state isn't in the contract. It's not in the Constitution. It'd be like you saying, oh, it's in the Constitution that I can step in and break it. That's the point I was trying to go after. So somebody's trying to break a contract with you, the people, when you hear that. So every time you hear separation of church and state, you should immediately say to yourself, somebody's trying to break a contract here. Because it's not in the Constitution. It was in a letter Jefferson wrote to I think it was a Unitarian minister, assuring him that no, you could open up a church, you can have your congregation, the government's not going to step in and shut you down or mess with you. You have a right to do that. So the freedom of religion, the freedom to practice religion, is not stopping you from practicing religion. It's stopping the government from saying one religion is better or will be practiced over others. So theoretically, you can have a nativity scene on the front, this town square. You can have a menorah. You can have a Kwanzaa thing, whatever they do for candles or whatever. You can have that. What the government can't do is say, we're only going to allow menorah. If you follow the idea that many atheists have, that there should be nothing on the town square, what you are essentially doing is saying to the government, you have a right to limit religion. You can limit all religions from the town square, except no religion. So you're supporting atheism. People need to be aware how your contract is being manipulated. I was going to talk about the whole GM stockholders thing, where the premium stockholders were going to get paid first during a bankruptcy. And the current administration stopped that, annulled that. So we're not going to do that. That's a contract. That's a legally binding contract. They just stepped in and said we're not going to follow that. And that actually brings, people say the Constitution is not a living, breathing document. It needs to flex its muscles. It needs to flow. If the government can step in and break that contract, the whole gay marriage issue is moot. Because they can break that, they can break a marriage contract between 2 men, 2 women, a man and a woman, 3 men, a man and the hubcaps from a 57 DeSoto. It doesn't matter. If you've made a contract and the government can break one contract, it can break them all. So at that point, it stops becoming an important discussion. If you want to get rid of the U.S. Constitution, you have to ask, what are you going to replace it with? If you're going to allow the federal government, which should have limited powers, to step in and breach contracts, what else can it do? And that's what people need to see. The U.S. Constitution is a contract, like you said, between the states and the federal government that they created. And essentially, it's a list of rules. Don't do this. Don't do this. And in fact, Barack Obama, as a state senator, you can Google this, talks about it on a radio program in Chicago, where he mentions he sort of didn't feel that the U.S. Constitution goes far enough. He felt that the Constitution should have a list of positive rights that tells the government what it can do for you. That is a complete and total abridgment of the contract. Because the contract limits the power of the federal government, doesn't give it ultimate power. That would be a suicide pact between the states themselves and this new government they make. And if you want to look into something, Google Second Bill of Rights. FDR had a second Bill of Rights. He believed you had a right to a job. Well, that sounds great. You know, let's all put tents on the town square and demand everybody has a job. Well, how do I know or anybody know what job you want? How, you know, in the 1960s, did people realize that IT professionals was going to become a high-paying job? I certainly didn't. I bought an Apple too. So how is the government, even if it has its best intentions, going to decide what job is right for you? You know, Elizabeth Warren and others say, you didn't build that. Orville and Wilbur Wright built the first airplane. What school did they go to learn aeronautical engineering? Well, duh, none, because there wasn't aeronautical engineering. They did it themselves. And so how would the federal government be able to imagine airline pilots, stewardesses, you know, air traffic control towers? So the minute you start demanding that people get something, you have to ask yourself, well, who's going to give it? And do the people that you're giving it to want it? That's unnatural, and that violates sort of the natural law aspect of let people work on their own. Well, if they work on their own, they're going to be evil to each other. I don't see that. I don't see people working on their own being evil to each other. I see people coming together during problems, everything from the L.A. riots. You know, I was there in the L.A. riots.
To Sandy. Look at what happened with Sandy.
Hurricane Sandy. The people in that area
yeah.
of Long Island, New Jersey area, should be looking very carefully at what their federal government, even with the best intentions, has been trying to do. It just can't, you can't do it. The further you separate the people who need help from the providers of help, the more chance you have of fraud getting in the middle. You need the people as close to the help that you need the people that need help close to the people who are giving it. Fire departments, people tell me, fire departments are socialism. Yeah, in a way they are, but they're there. They're in the neighborhood. They fight neighborhood fires. Worcester Fire Department isn't called to New York City to fight New York City fires. Or they're not called to London to fight London fires. They fight Worcester fires. Now, if there's a major emergency, they might send people out to help. But the idea is the further apart you separate the people who need help from where the help comes, you invite corruption in the middle.
You mentioned the Bill of Rights before. The second Bill of Rights, which is something I had never heard about FDR. Now, the thing that becomes kind of an interesting mind game to play, the Bill of Rights was basically written, as I remember, by Madison. And it was used as a wedge because you needed 9 out of the 13 to ratify this whole thing.
I wouldn't use the term wedge. It was used as a carrot at the end of a stick.
And without that, you wouldn't have had approval.
Right.
Now, what I came to find out is that obviously we had 10 amendments that were part of the Bill of Rights. But initially, they came up with 12 amendments. 10 of the 12 were ratified. One of the 12 was it's the 27th Amendment that was ratified in the 1990s. And I can't remember what the 27th Amendment is right now. And supposedly the 12th item that was put up is also still being looked at as we speak. So these folks had a pretty good handle on the different elements that they wanted to present as part of this bill, the initial Bill of Rights.
The reason while you were talking, I went here, I wanted to show people how easy this document is. You said 27 minutes, what is it? Boom, I can open and go right here. No law that changes the pay of senators and representatives will take effect until after it has become law and a subsequent election of representatives has taken place.
So they can't vote for their own.
Can't vote for their
own raises. But
in fact, they're trying to vote to hold them up now.
Now, at a fundamental level, that's the beauty of this document. You don't have to have 10 lawyers and a stenographer and a weightlifter to carry the document in and have 20 people flipping through it. Boom, there it is. We can find it.
And what was your source material again?
Oh, this is The Constitution Made Easy by Michael Haller. This is a signed copy, but because I got it directly from him. But the beauty of this is it has the original wording And then on the facing page, it has sort of a more modern, so you can understand what it means.
Along with the listing of the amendments and
All the way to the 27th.
it's all right there.
It's all right here. You can go online, you can buy this. He's got a DVD you can buy which shows him talking about the U.S. Constitution. There's a lot of information there. There's information you can get from the Heritage website. You go online, there's all kinds of people talking about the U.S. The Constitution was meant to be talked about. It was not meant to be kept in a dusty bookshelf somewhere. It was really meant to be discussed and dealt with. It's not a living document in the sense you can reinterpret it. It's a contract. Now, we were talking about that. I was going to save this to the end, but I'll read. This is my second quote I'm going to bring up. This is George Washington on his farewell address on September 17th, 1796. Part of his address is, if in the opinion of the people the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way which the Constitution designates. But let there be no change by usurpation, for though this in one instance may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. This was written in 1796 by the first President of the United States, and you would think he was alive today, based upon what's going on. The Constitution has ways for it to be changed. Mm-hmm. Sadly, for some people, it doesn't get changed fast enough, because there are people out there that feel that you can regulate human behavior with law. And we know that that's not the case. We can regulate consequence by law, but you're not going to stop people from breaking the law. And the other Constitution amendment I was going to bring up was the, and again, I don't have the top of my head, the one outlawing alcohol. 17th? No. 18th, something like. But there we have a group of people, meaning well, wanted to stop the ravages of alcoholism in this country, so they made an amendment banning alcohol. Sounds good. It sounds like it would be helpful. Now, yes, on one hand, it gave us NASCAR, but on the other hand, it gave us Al Capone and organized crime. I don't know if NASCAR is worth that. I think Americans would have invented NASCAR without moonshine bootlegging. But there's an example of what happens when you try to regulate human behavior with law. It's not natural. What you need to do is make the law apply to everybody equally, which apparently it doesn't. There was another thing that happened very recently where you had the newscaster holding up a magazine in Washington, D.C. It's illegal. No one's arrested him. But we had a soldier who had a couple rounds of ammunition in his backpack. He didn't realize. He got arrested.
Oh, I love that music, but I hate it because this could go on for another hour or two. There's so much material here. It's great. I want to thank you very, very much for sitting with us for a second show. We'd like to invite you back down the road to get into this in a little bit greater depth as well. So thanks very, very much for being here. Interesting show, huh? But how do you condense all of that? It's